The first pale line of morning crept between the pines when Alina stirred beneath her wool blanket. For a long moment she listened, to the creak of logs in the wind, to the far cry of a jay, until the hush of the forest settled into her pulse. She rose barefoot, and touched the carved antler nailed above the hearth. Her father's old trophy, smooth from years of her fingers tracing it. "Watch the place, old guardian," she murmured, the way she always did before leaving. A faint smell of dried thyme hung in the cabin, sweet, sharp, a scent that clung to every timber. Alina lit the small clay lamp, warmed a bit of porridge, and drank from a tin cup of herb tea that tasted of smoke and earth. Then she dressed for the bog. Thick canvas trousers, oil-stained jacket, high boots that had seen too many seasons. From the wall she lifted her rucksack, patched but sturdy, slipped a knife into its sheath at her belt, and looped a small axe to the strap. Her movements were calm and practiced, as if the wilderness itself watched and approved. Outside, the air was silver with mist. Dew glittered on the spruce needles, and from somewhere unseen came the soft drip of water collecting from branch to branch. She paused by the door, adjusting her pack. The antler caught the dim light and seemed to glow. "I'll be gone a while," she whispered to it. "Guard the hearth until I'm back." Then she turned toward the path that vanished into the trees. The earth was soft underfoot, the smell of moss and resin rising with each step. Somewhere ahead, in the low, wet hollows, grew the rare golden root she sought, stubborn, medicinal, worth a journey through the fog. Alina tightened the strap across her shoulder, pulled the hood up against the damp, and disappeared into the forest's pale breath, leaving only the quiet cabin and its silent watcher behind. By mid-morning the light had thickened into a pale blur, and the path beneath Alina's boots dissolved into a ribbon of shadow between leaning firs. The forest was heavy with silence. Even the usual chatter of thrushes had gone still, as if the world were holding its breath. She moved carefully, parting damp branches, her eyes scanning for the mossy rise that marked the edge of the bog. Each few steps she stooped to gather sprigs of valerian and wild mint, tucking them into a linen pouch tied to her belt. The small motions steadied her. They were the language of her solitude. But something changed in the air. The faint scent of wet earth was replaced by a bitter tang, smoke faint but wrong. She stopped, testing the wind. The mist had thickened, dragging low like tattered gauze over the ground. It muffled the world, swallowed depth and color. "Strange," she murmured. "No storm, no fire." A chill pricked at her neck. She took the compass from her pocket, checked the trembling needle, and saw that she had drifted slightly east of the trail she meant to follow. The bogs were treacherous here, wander too far, and the earth could open underfoot. Still, that smell drew her on. The fog moved with her, curling between tree trunks, carrying the faint hiss of unseen water. A frog croaked somewhere, and was swallowed by the distance. Soon her boots found softer ground. The moss sank under her weight, the air turned cold and still. She could sense the nearness of open mire, that wide, slow breath of the earth where things both lived and sank. She paused at the edge of a low ridge. Below her, the fog pooled like milk, veiling whatever lay beneath. Alina crouched, listening. Nothing. Not even wind. The unease that stirred in her chest wasn't fear exactly. It was the instinct of someone who had lived too long among quiet things, who knew when silence meant danger. She gripped the haft of her small axe, not to use it, but to feel its solid weight anchor her. Then, from somewhere deep within the fog, came a faint metallic sound, a click, or a hollow creak. One sound, then silence again. Alina's pulse jumped. Something was out there, half buried in the mire and hidden by the mist. She hesitated, drew a slow breath of cold, smoky air, and began her descent toward it, each step sinking deeper into the strange hush that waited below. The fog parted as Alina stepped down the slope, and at first she thought she was seeing a strange boulder. Then the shape resolved, dark, curved, metallic. It crouched amid the reeds like some enormous insect trapped in the swamp. A small aircraft. A wreck. The body of it was half swallowed by mud, one side twisted and blackened. The rotor blades were broken, one bent deep into the peat, another sheared off entirely. The acrid smell she had noticed before was stronger here. Burned oil, hot metal long gone cold. Her first impulse was to turn back. This was not her world. Machines meant trouble, officials, questions, noise. but a low, intermittent creak drifted from the open cockpit, a sound like the breath of something still alive. She tightened her grip on the axe and stepped closer. The bog gurgled under her boots. Black water seeped around the soles. Through the cracked window, she glimpsed a shape slumped over the controls. "Saints," she whispered. The pilot's head hung at an unnatural angle. His left arm lay twisted beneath him, his clothes soaked with mud. For a heartbeat she thought him dead. Until a faint motion shivered his shoulder, a weak gasp escaping his lips. "Hold on," Alina muttered. She wedged the axe head into the warped seam of the door and heaved. The metal screamed. Again, harder, and the hinge tore loose with a sucking noise, letting out a rush of stale air. Inside smelled of fuel and rot. She reached in, trying not to think, just move. Unbuckled the straps, tugged at the heavy weight of his body. The aircraft shifted with a slow, ominous groan, sinking another inch into the muck. "Come on, don't you dare die now," she hissed, bracing one foot on the fuselage. With a final pull she dragged him free, both of them collapsing onto a patch of firmer moss. The pilot lay limp, mud-streaked, his face pale beneath the grime. She pressed her ear to his chest. A heartbeat, fragile but steady. Relief washed through her, sharp as pain. "Fool," she whispered, to him, to herself, to the whole drowned forest that kept its secrets so well. The wreck creaked again, slowly tilting, the cockpit filling with brown water. If she had come tomorrow, she realized, there would have been no one left to save. Alina sat back on her heels, breath clouding in the cold air. Around them the fog drifted silently, erasing the world. She looked down at the stranger. Young city-born, utterly out of place in her wild domain. "All right," she said at last, reaching for her knife to cut branches. "Let's see if the forest will let you live." Alina worked quickly. The mire was swallowing the wreck piece by piece, and the pilot's shallow breaths rasped like sand in a hollow shell. She scanned the edge of the bog and spotted a cluster of birch saplings, thin, flexible, and strong enough for her purpose. Her knife flashed in the fog. One by one, the slender trunks came down with crisp, wet cracks. She stripped them of branches, her hands moving automatically, as if guided by memory rather than thought. From her pack she pulled an old canvas cloak and a length of rope. Soon, on the mossy ground beside her, lay a crude sled. Two poles lashed together with the cloak stretched between them. The man moaned faintly when she lifted him. His arm dangled at a wrong angle, but he was alive, warm still. Alina adjusted his weight onto the makeshift litter, tucking a bundle of reeds under his head to keep it from jolting. "There," she murmured. "You've got breath enough for now." When she straightened, the horizon had nearly vanished. The fog pressed close, dulling all color. Her cabin lay several hours to the west, uphill, through forest and bog. She tightened her scarf, looped the rope across her shoulders, and leaned into the pull. The first stretch was brutal. The sled caught on roots, skidded in ruts, filled with clinging muck. Every few steps she had to stop, catch her breath, and listen for the faint pulse of life behind her. Once she almost gave up, her knees shaking, throat raw from breathing the damp. But something inside her, stubborn and unyielding, kept her moving. Hours passed. The sun was a pale blur above the mist, sliding down toward dusk. Alina's arms burned, her back throbbed, but the shape of the cabin at last formed in her mind like a promise: warmth, fire, shelter. She muttered encouragement to herself, to him, to the forest that watched in silence. By the time she reached the clearing, twilight had deepened into smoke-blue shadow. The stag's antler above the door caught the last of the light, gleaming faintly as she stumbled toward it. "See, old guardian," she gasped, dragging the sled over the threshold. "I brought company." Inside, she rolled him gently onto the floor near the hearth. His face was ghostly pale. His pulse fluttered beneath her fingertips. Alina lit the fire, fed it dry pine, and sat back on her heels, sweat streaking her face. The crackle of flame filled the small cabin, chasing out the fog that had followed them. "You're safe," she whispered to the unconscious stranger. "For now, that'll have to be enough." Outside, the forest exhaled, and the night closed around the little house, a fragile bubble of light in a sea of mist and silence. The fire had burned down to a steady orange glow by the time Alina finished stripping the man's soaked clothes. Steam rose from his skin, pale beneath the grime mottled with bruises. She wrapped him in wool blankets, then fetched her water pot and a handful of herbs from the shelf, willow bark, meadowsweet, dried yarrow. The room filled with their scent as she crushed and mixed them, the pestle's dull rhythm steadying her hands. She brewed the mash in a clay bowl, watching the steam curl upward, carrying the faint bitterness of healing. "Drink this or try to," she murmured, sliding an arm under his shoulders. His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. She pressed the rim of the bowl to his lips, letting a few drops run into his mouth. Some he swallowed, some spilled down his chin. It was enough. Alina worked by habit and instinct, cutting linen strips, boiling water, binding his arm against a splint made from birch slats. When she found the shallow wound along his ribs, she cleaned it carefully with spirits, then covered it with a poultice that smelled sharply of resin and earth. All the while she spoke in low tones. Not words meant for him exactly, but for the room, for herself, for the long dark hours that stretched ahead. "You've chosen a bad place to fall, stranger. The bog doesn't forgive easy, but I've seen worse things live." The man shivered. Fever was coming. She could feel it in the heat radiating from his skin. She dipped cloths in cold water and laid them across his brow and chest. Outside, wind moved through the pines, a sound like breathing. At some point the night blurred into dream. She sat in her chair by the hearth, half asleep, watching the flames twist. Images came and went. Her father's rough hands stirring herbs, her mother humming over a boiling pot, the heavy knock of a door the year the soldiers came. A sudden moan tore her back to the present. The pilot was thrashing weakly, muttering nonsense. Fragments of words, names she didn't know. She knelt, pressing his shoulder down gently, murmuring quiet nonsense of her own. His breath steadied by degrees, falling back into rhythm. Hours passed like that, tending, waiting, dosing him with spoonfuls of willow water. When at last she looked up, the gray light of dawn was spreading through the small window. The fever had broken. Beads of sweat shone on his forehead, but his color had returned, faintly pink. Alina exhaled long and slow. Her body ached as if she'd been hauling the bog again. She threw another log on the fire and sat back, eyes half closing. "You'll live," she said softly, the words somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. "And now we'll see who you are." The first birds began to sing outside, thin, tentative notes of morning. Inside, the cabin smelled of herbs and smoke, of healing and exhaustion, and of something else just beginning to take root, the fragile quiet of two lives colliding by chance. When the man finally woke, the rain had been falling for hours, a soft, steady tapping on the roof that mingled with the crackle of the fire. Alina was grinding dried bark at the table when she heard the faint rustle of blankets behind her. She turned. His eyes were open, unfocused, gray-green like a river stone. He tried to sit up, grimaced, and fell back with a low groan. "Easy," Alina said, crossing to him. "You'll tear the stitches." He blinked, disoriented. "Where am I?" "In my cabin. The forest, west of the marshlands." She poured him a bit of water, held the cup to his lips. "You crashed. You're lucky the mire didn't take you whole." He swallowed, then coughed. "How long?" "2 nights. Maybe more if you count the fever you nearly burned through." For a while he only breathed, staring at the firelight flickering on the ceiling beams. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "You pulled me out?" "Yes." A faint smile touched his cracked lips. "Then I owe you my life." Alina shrugged, uncomfortable. "You owe me quiet and time to heal. Nothing else." He studied her face for a moment, the smudge of ash on her cheek, the unkempt braid of dark hair falling over her shoulder, and seemed about to say something more. Instead, he closed his eyes and exhaled. After a moment, Alina fetched a bowl of broth. "Eat what you can." He obeyed, though each spoonful seemed to cost effort. Between sips he murmured, "My name's Maxim." She froze a heartbeat before answering. "Alina." He nodded, eyes still half-lidded. "They'll be looking for me." "Who?" He hesitated. "People from the city. My employer. Maybe my uncle." His gaze flickered, uneasy. "They won't rest long once they know I'm missing." Alina said nothing. She watched him for a while, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the faint tremor in his hand when he reached for the cup again. Whoever this man was, he didn't belong here. Not in her quiet forest, not in her life. Yet here he lay, as if the wilderness itself had brought him to her doorstep. When he drifted back to sleep, she rose and stepped outside. The rain was lighter now, mist rising from the wet earth. She stood under the eaves, listening to the forest breathe. Maxim, she whispered to herself, tasting the name. It sounded like a question more than an answer. Behind her, the fire crackled, steady and patient, the only witness to the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. Days passed like water dripping from the eaves. Slow, measured, unremarkable on their own, but together they filled the silence between them. Maxim healed bit by bit. His color returned, the bruises faded from violet to yellow, and the splint on his arm became less a restraint than a reminder of weakness. Alina kept busy. She gathered wood, brewed tinctures, checked the trap she'd set by the brook. When she came back, the cabin always smelled of pine smoke and broth, and Maxim sat by the window in her old wool coat, watching the rain or tracing shapes in the fog. He spoke little at first. Words cost him strength. But sometimes when she forgot he was there, she'd catch him smiling faintly, at the way she hummed while chopping roots, or how she scolded the kettle when it boiled over. One evening as she strained nettle tea, he said quietly, "You live here alone?" "I have the forest," she replied without looking up. "And the marsh. They keep me company." "That's not an answer." She smirked. "It's the only one I've got." He chuckled, then winced, pressing his ribs. The laugh faded into a sigh. "You saved me, and you don't even ask who I am." "I asked," she said, pouring his tea. "You told me your name. The rest will come when it's ready." The rain outside deepened, drumming softly on the roof. Maxim stared at the fire. In the city, no one waits for things to be ready. They just take. That's why the city burns itself out. Their eyes met then, a brief, unguarded look. There was something in his gaze that unsettled her, something she didn't want to name. Not gratitude but recognition, as if he saw the same emptiness in her that he carried in himself. After that, silence returned, but it wasn't the uneasy kind. It was companionable, stretched gently between two people learning to share air. By the fourth evening, he insisted on helping, chopping kindling one-handed while she mended a torn shirt near the hearth. The work was clumsy, but she didn't stop him. She only watched, quietly amused, as he muttered curses at the stubborn wood. "City hands," she teased. "All soft and proud." "I'll toughen them," he said, breathing hard. "Give me a week. You'll last 2 days before you break something else." He grinned, and for the first time it reached his eyes. Later, when she went to fetch water, she paused at the door. Behind her, Maxim was dozing in the firelight, his face peaceful in a way that seemed borrowed from another life. Alina lingered a moment longer than she meant to, then stepped into the night. The stars were faint above the mist, and somewhere a night bird called. For the first time in years, she felt the forest silence not as emptiness, but as promise. The first clear morning in a week broke bright and sharp. The rain had rinsed the air clean, and sunlight glinted on every pine needle. Maxim, though still weak, insisted he could manage alone for a few hours. "I'm not a child," he said when Alina hesitated by the door. "You're worse," she replied. "Children at least know when to rest." He laughed, and that small, honest sound followed her as she set out toward the settlement. The path to the village wound through thin birches and overgrown fields where the grass reached her knees. She hadn't gone in months. The forest gave her what she needed, but salt, lamp oil, and flour were running low. She walked briskly, enjoying the light and the distant hum of human life she usually avoided. By midday, the crooked wooden sign of the general store came into view, leaning like an old drunk against the wind. Inside, the air smelled of dust, tobacco, and dried apples. "Alina Vetrova," the shopkeeper greeted, squinting at her from behind the counter. "Haven't seen you since before the thaw." "Needed supplies," she said simply, setting her list down. As he fetched what she asked for, a pair of men by the stove were deep in conversation, their voices low but carrying. "Big reward, I heard. 50,000 rubles if he's found alive." "Alive? Ha! After a crash like that? They're dreaming." "Still, Mornov's got money to burn. He's sending men through every district from here to the steppe." Alina froze. That name, Mornov, landed like a stone in her stomach. The men kept talking. Some say it was his nephew, the pilot. Others claim the old man's sick, maybe dying, and wants the boy back to make peace. "Bah," the other scoffed. "Peace? Mornov doesn't know the word. Remember the fire at the copper plant? My cousin lost half his hand, and they gave him a week's pay to disappear. Their laughter was harsh and familiar, the kind of laughter born of bitterness. Alina turned away, pulse drumming in her ears. The name tasted of ashes. Mornov, the same man whose factories had swallowed her father's life, whose name her mother refused to speak even on her deathbed. And now his kin was lying in her cabin, drinking her broth, sleeping under her roof. The shopkeeper handed her the parcel. Everything all right? You look pale. Fine, she lied. Just tired from the walk. She paid, tucked the goods into her bag, and left quickly, the bell over the door jangling behind her. Outside the sun was bright, but she barely saw it. Her thoughts ran cold and fast. Maxim Mornov. It fit too neatly, the city clothes, the aircraft, the vague evasions about his family. By the time she reached the forest edge again, anger had taken root beneath her ribs. The same family that had ruined hers. Now her hands had saved one of them. She stopped, clutching the strap of her pack, staring into the green-shadowed path home. The trees were silent, waiting. Not yet, she whispered to herself and stepped into the woods, carrying with her the first bitter crack in the fragile peace she and the stranger had built. The walk home felt longer than usual. Every turn of the path seemed to echo with the name she couldn't shake. Mornov. By the time the roof of her cabin appeared through the pines, Alina's thoughts had hardened into something sharp and cold. Inside, the air was warm, the scent of broth and wood smoke gentle, almost forgiving. Maxim sat near the hearth, trying to mend a strap on his jacket. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. You're back sooner than I thought, he said. Did you find what you needed? She set the basket down, keeping her voice steady. More than I planned to. He didn't notice the edge in her tone. I even tried walking to the brook, he said, proud. The arm holds fine if I keep it tight. You shouldn't have, she replied automatically, then caught herself, the habit of care irritating her now. She busied herself unpacking salt, flour, the small wrapped parcel of matches, anything to avoid looking at him. Maxim watched her a moment. Something's wrong. Alina hesitated, her back still turned. The words pushed at her throat like water behind ice. I heard your name today, she said finally. He frowned. My name. Your family name. She turned then, meeting his eyes. Mornov. He went still. The air between them seemed to tighten. Where did you? At the store. They said the Mornov heir crashed somewhere in these parts. That his uncle is sick. That he's sending men and money to find him. Maxim's mouth opened, then closed again. Alina, don't. The single word came out sharper than she meant. You should have told me. I had the right to know who I was dragging out of that swamp. He drew a slow breath. Would it have changed anything? Yes, she said, her voice trembling. It would have. Silence filled the cabin, thick and uneven. The fire crackled, throwing restless shadows across the walls. Maxim looked down at his hands. I didn't lie, he said quietly. You never asked what my family name was. I didn't think I was saving the blood of the man who destroyed mine. He looked up then, startled. Destroyed? My father worked in one of Mornov's factories. When they cut the wages, he led the protest. They sent guards. He never came home. The words hung there, brittle as frost. Maxim's face drained of color. I didn't know, he said. I swear. Of course you didn't. Her tone softened, but only slightly. People like your uncle never know what happens at the bottom. They just build more smoke to hide it. He stood, unsteady but determined. I'm not him, Alina. Maybe not, she said. But his name sits on your tongue like an inheritance. And I've lived long enough to know that names carry debts. For a long moment they faced each other, the forest's wild daughter and the heir of the man she'd learned to hate. Finally she turned away. Rest, she said flatly. You'll need your strength. The world will come for you soon enough. She stepped outside before he could answer, the cold air biting her cheeks. The forest was still, indifferent, the pines whispering nothing. Somewhere behind her, the man she had saved sat by her fire. And between them, invisible but growing fast, lay the dark seed of betrayal. Night fell thick and early over the forest, and Alina paced the cabin floor. The sounds of the wilderness pressing against the walls like a warning. Maxim slept fitfully by the hearth, a blanket pulled over him, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. Each breath reminded her of the debt she owed, and the danger that now loomed closer. She sat by the window, tracing patterns in the frost that had begun to coat the glass. Thoughts of her father, of the family she had lost, circled her mind relentlessly. Mornov's name echoed in the quiet, cold as iron. The bloodline she had spared might now bring ruin to her doorstep. A sudden movement behind her drew her attention. Maxim stirred, eyes opening slowly. "Alina." "Yes," she replied, keeping her voice calm. "You're awake. Good." I'm sorry," he said, voice rough with sleep. "I should have told you sooner." She shook her head, frustration and sorrow warring in her chest. "You didn't know. That's the problem. You are not to blame for your uncle's sins. But his reach is long, and it's coming for you, for both of us." He sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "Then we fight." She studied him for a moment. The man in front of her, once a helpless survivor, now carried a fragile strength. "We survive," she said finally. "And surviving means making choices, hard ones. Choices I thought I'd never have to make again." Maxim nodded, absorbing the weight of her words. "I'll follow your lead," he said. "You've saved me once. I trust you to do it again." Alina exhaled, feeling the fire in the hearth burn warmth into her frozen fingers. She could see him clearly now, not as a Mornov, not as the son of a man she hated, but as someone caught between life and death, between loyalty and fate. "We prepare," she said. "Supplies, herbs, traps. The forest will protect us if we listen. And you must stay quiet. No unnecessary movements, no alarms. The world beyond these trees does not forgive mistakes." He glanced at her, a flicker of fear mingled with respect. "I can do that." "Good," she said, standing. "Tomorrow we begin to plan. Every step matters. One wrong move and it will cost everything." Outside, the wind rustled the pines, carrying the distant echo of a world neither of them fully understood. Inside, Alina lit another log, and the cabin glowed with a fragile light. For the first time since he had arrived, she allowed herself a moment to consider the path ahead. Dangerous, uncertain, but hers to choose. And in the shadow of the coming storm, she felt the weight of both her vengeance and her mercy settling into her hands. The dawn crept slowly over the horizon, pale and brittle, brushing the treetops with a hesitant light. Alina was already moving, gathering dried herbs and kindling while Maxim struggled into his boots. The forest smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and clean, as if the night had washed it anew. "You'll need more than speed," she said, adjusting the strap of her pack. "You've got strength, yes, but patience is what keeps you alive here." "I can do patience," he muttered, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed him. The two of them moved silently through the mist, Alina leading, eyes scanning the undergrowth for traps, roots, and unstable ground. Maxim followed closely, careful not to disturb the forest's rhythm. Every snap of twig or shift in moss made him flinch, a stark contrast to the city life he had known, where the dangers were predictable and the rules clear. Halfway to the northern ridge, Alina paused and crouched beside a shallow stream. She dipped her fingers into the icy water, letting the liquid run over Maxim's hands as she guided him to wash the blood and mud from his injuries. "Pain teaches you limits," she said quietly. "But limits are temporary. Respect them and you survive. Ignore them, and you vanish." He nodded, listening as much to her tone as her words. Something in her presence steadied him, though he did not yet fully trust it. She worked with precise motions, adjusting the splint on his arm, checking the bruises along his ribs, tightening laces and knots where needed. The sun had climbed higher when they reached a small clearing on the ridge. From here, Alina could see the tops of the distant pines stretching into fog. She pulled a map from her pack, marking the paths they could take if someone came looking. "You understand?" she asked. "There's no room for hesitation. One false move, one careless glance, and they'll find you. And if they do, they won't leave quietly." "I understand," he said, eyes meeting hers, steady and sober. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the cold wind biting their cheeks, the forest stretching endlessly before them. Alina felt the weight of her choices settle around her shoulders. Protecting Maxim was no longer an act of simple compassion. It was a gamble, a reckoning, a decision that could unearth old pain she had thought buried. She turned to him. Today we start preparing. Traps, routes, signals. Everything you think is trivial could be the difference between life and death. He nodded again, the first flicker of resolve in his gaze. The childlike fear had faded, replaced by something sharper. The awareness that he now depended entirely on her knowledge, her skill, and her instinct. Alina inhaled the forest air, letting it steel her nerves. The fog might still cling to the ground, the trees might whisper secrets, but inside a new certainty had taken root. They would face the coming storm together, with courage, cunning, and a quiet resolve forged in the cold dawn. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the high canopy in fractured shafts, dust motes floating lazily in the golden beams. Alina worked near the edge of the clearing, arranging sharpened stakes and tripwires with meticulous care, while Maxim followed her instructions, fumbling at first but gradually learning the rhythm. Not like the city, she said, motioning at the uneven forest floor. The earth here has memory. Step wrong, and it will punish you. He paused, bending over a tangle of roots. I think I'm beginning to understand. Alina didn't respond immediately. Her mind had wandered, circling memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. The sawmill on fire, her mother's faint smile, her father's hands working tirelessly among the timber and herbs. Every memory was edged with loss, a reminder of why she fought so fiercely for control over this small domain she called home. You move too fast, she finally said, noticing Maxim's eager but clumsy motions. Every trap you set must be precise. One mistake, and it's your life, not just mine, that hangs in the balance. He nodded, swallowing hard, eyes tracing her hands and the careful lines she marked on the ground. I will do it right, he said, voice steadier now. Hours passed, the sun dipping toward the horizon, and the forest shadows grew long and uncertain. Alina paused and leaned against a tree, wiping sweat from her brow. Maxim had done well, but she could sense the strain behind his calm. You're improving faster than I expected, she said. But there's more at stake than simple survival. You carry a name that could bring the forest down upon us if the wrong eyes catch sight of you. He glanced at her, pale but resolute. I don't care about the name. I care about being alive, and about you trusting me enough to stand here beside you. Alina's lips pressed into a thin line. His words were unpolished, yet there was honesty in them, and a faint warmth crept into her chest despite the unease twisting her gut. She had spent years trusting no one. Now, against all her instincts, she found herself relying on someone who bore the legacy of the very family she loathed. Good, she said finally. Tomorrow we expand. More traps, better coverage. And we'll review the paths again. If they come, I want to know they will find nothing but shadows and ghosts. Maxim nodded, glancing at the forest that had once seemed alien, now slowly becoming his world. Guided by her, shaped by the wilderness, and shielded by the determination she instilled in him. As twilight settled, the two of them returned to the cabin, the last golden rays slipping beneath the trees. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, the quiet punctuated only by distant bird calls. Inside, Alina stoked the fire and began preparing a simple meal, her mind restless with strategies and memories alike. Maxim moved about carefully, watching her, learning. And for the first time in weeks, Alina allowed herself to feel the strange, uneasy sense that the forest, and perhaps this strange, uninvited companion, might yet offer her more than survival. Perhaps it could offer her a chance to rewrite the past, or at least face it with strength she had thought lost. The next morning, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it a hint of cold rain and the distant, unsettling promise of movement beyond the trees. Alina tightened the straps on her pack, checking her pouches of herbs, sharpening her knives, and reviewing the network of traps they had laid over the past days. Maxim stood nearby, practicing cautious steps along the hidden paths she had taught him. His confidence had grown, though the shadow of fear still lingered in his posture. They'll come, Alina said quietly, as if speaking the thought aloud might summon it. It's only a matter of time. You must remember, patience first. Everything else second. Maxim nodded, eyes scanning the horizon. I can wait. I've learned from you. She allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned her attention to a distant ridge where the fog clung to the trees in thick, unbroken waves. See that? That's our first line. If they move that way, we'll know. Every sound matters. Hours passed in tense preparation. Alina moved with precise efficiency, setting small tripwires and concealing markings along narrow paths. Maxim assisted where he could, often silently, following her guidance and learning the subtleties of forest survival. By late afternoon, clouds thickened overhead, a gray curtain stretching across the sky. Rain began to fall in thin sheets, soaking the forest floor and masking their movements. Alina felt the tension in the air, the kind that presses against the skin and sets nerves on edge. Suddenly, a faint rustle in the undergrowth caught her attention. She froze, signaling Maxim to do the same. The sound repeated, cautious, deliberate. Someone was moving through their perimeter, testing it. Alina's mind raced. Stay calm, she whispered. Let them make the first mistake. Maxim's pulse thudded audibly in his ears, but he obeyed, crouching low behind a cluster of ferns. Minutes stretched, each one heavy with anticipation. Then came a louder crack of a branch underfoot, a misstep, a hint that the intruder had underestimated the forest. Alina's lips pressed into a thin line, the corner of a plan forming. We'll draw them in, she murmured. They'll think the forest is empty, but we'll be ready. Maxim swallowed, nodding. He trusted her, despite the revelations about his family and the storm of uncertainty that had settled between them. Outside, the rain fell harder, turning the forest into a gray, dripping maze. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound amplified. The storm was coming, and with it, the first true test of their resolve, skill, and the fragile trust they had built in each other. Alina clenched her fists, feeling the sharp edge of determination slice through fear. This was no longer just survival. This was a reckoning. The forest was a living labyrinth in the early hours, shrouded in mist and the low rumble of distant thunder. Alina moved silently, her boots sinking into damp earth, senses heightened to every snap of twig, every whisper of wind. Maxim followed, tense but alert, his breathing measured as she had taught him. They're close, she murmured, voice barely more than the hiss of the rain. Remember everything, every trap, every signal. One misstep and it's over. A low rustle ahead drew her attention. Shadows flickered between the trees, shifting unnaturally with the storm's dim light. Alina signaled Maxim to halt, crouching behind a thick pine. She scanned the perimeter, noting footprints and the subtle breaks in foliage. Not a large party, just one or two intruders testing the perimeter. She adjusted her stance, readying the first set of countermeasures. A taut wire, almost invisible in the dim light, stretched across a narrow path. Weighted with small logs, it would trip anyone careless enough to pass. Now, she whispered, and Maxim's eyes followed hers, wide but trusting. The intruders stepped into the trap with a soft crunch. One tumbled forward, arms flailing, and Alina and Maxim moved quickly, shadows among shadows. She directed Maxim to push a second obstacle into place while she approached the first with precise, practiced movements. The man cursed, struggling to rise, and the rain plastered his hair to his forehead. Alina's presence was sudden, calm, and unyielding. You shouldn't have come here, she said, voice carrying authority forged by years of solitude and survival. He froze, recognizing something unspoken in her tone. The forest itself seemed to obey her will. Maxim, his heart pounding, kept to the edge, aware of the danger but also of the unspoken lesson. Alina moved with fluid precision, ensuring the intruder was contained without unnecessary harm. She knew every trap, every hidden branch, every pattern of the ground. The forest was her ally, and today it became their shield. You underestimated the woods, she said, stepping back as the man scrambled to recover. And you underestimated me. A distant roll of thunder punctuated her words, the storm amplifying the tension. Maxim exhaled quietly, relief mingling with awe. The first strike had been theirs, swift, controlled, and decisive. Alina surveyed the clearing, eyes sharp. This is just the beginning. They'll learn quickly, and so must we. Tonight, we review every trap, every path. Tomorrow we move again. Patience, Maxim. Precision. Survival comes first. He nodded, understanding for the first time the full weight of her lessons. The storm continued to fall around them, rain drumming on leaves, thunder echoing through the pines, and within the tempest, the two of them stood, ready, resolute, and unbroken.